See Juan Williams on Fox News and Fox Business quite often on the Brett Baer Show, sitting on the All-Star panel. A returning guest to the John and Amy Gab Fest. We always like his opinion and analysis. Juan, welcome back to the program. How are you, sir?
I'm chilly, but I'm fine. How are you this cold morning?
Similar here in Chicago. Well, earlier this week, I said, wow, what did Juan Williams say? I believe I heard him say that some in the liberal media are actually looking forward to civil unrest / a riot in Ferguson, Missouri. Is that a correct interpretation?
No interpretation. That's a fact. That's what I said.
Well, would you elaborate for our listeners? Because I think that a lot of us agree with you.
Oh, well, I think that if you look at the kinds of coverage of Ferguson right now, it's almost as if there would be disappointment on the part of some, especially I think in the liberal media quarters, if black people didn't riot. And I think this is so condescending and crazy. First of all, riots do nothing but damage the black community. Mm-hmm. I think it depresses home values, damages retail business, including black-owned business, makes it harder for kids to go to school. And if you look at the history of rioting in our country, racial rioting I'm speaking about, back to the 60s or after Rodney King in L.A. in the 90s, I don't see that any of these provocateurs are around to clean up, rebuild, restock shelves. And the media contributes to this by giving platforms, it seems to me, to the most outrageous, vile, and at times racist commentary, and then saying, well, that's the voice of the angry people. And I think, nonsense. You know, in some cases in the Ferguson situation, John and Amy, these aren't even people from Ferguson, but, you know, people hungry for the camera's attention who flock to Ferguson and then take advantage of the situation. I just think it's reprehensible.
But do you still consider it a race riot if some Caucasians, some white people are in there rioting with the African Americans?
Oh, I think that it's all done in the spirit of a race riot, and that's why it attracts all kinds of people and maybe all kinds of race. You know, it's to me, and this is a terribly sad and maybe unfair analogy, but it's like watching Americans who want to go over and be jihadists. You know, people will be attracted, and I think people with emotional or other kinds of problems, to any kind of turmoil in the world. I just think, given that this is on the home front, and given the history I have in terms of writing histories of black America, I just think this is terrible, and I wish the media would stop it.
But people are trying to get a calm response to the decision that's going to be rendered or announced in the next week. You know, you have Mr. Johnson going to schools, asking people to be calm, to take a different approach to this.
Right.
Do you think any of that will work?
I don't know if it'll work, but I think it's worth the effort, and I think it's just terrific, and I think that the family has been very clear, you know, that they don't consider it a tribute to their dead son that people would get out in the street and behave badly.
Ron Johnson, the state police officer who has been working there. Yeah, but Ron Johnson, while he has gravitas and a badge, he's no Al Sharpton. And I know you didn't mention Al Sharpton by name, but those are the kind of guys who come into the community and provoke and cause the trouble, in my opinion. We're talking here with Juan Williams, political analyst for Fox News. You know, also talk about it's so insulting to black America, assuming that we're going to have riots in Ferguson. I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. Now, look at some of the people that have been elected on the Republican side who are being ignored by black America and prominent African-American politicians just because of their politics. I'm talking about Miss Love out in Utah, Will Hurd, the former CIA agent who became the first black Republican elected to Congress from Texas, and others. Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, and Mia Love, of course, out in Utah. You defended them this week against people like Clyburn and other leaders of the black political community.
I did, because I was kind of surprised. I mean, obviously, I'm a black Democrat, and I just thought, gosh, black Republicans had a landmark marquee day 2 weeks ago in the election. The idea that there is a black senator from South Carolina, be he Republican or Democrat, that's historic. That's unbelievable. You know, that's the state where the Civil War started, a state that's still riven by lots of racial divides, and somehow a man running as a Republican was able to win the Senate seat in North Carolina. I just think you got to take your hat off to Tim Scott. But the reaction from the Democrats, especially the black Democrats, and you mentioned Congressman Jim Clyburn, who is from South Carolina, was, well, it's a victory if you consider this a victory to elect a man who votes 90% of the time against the interest of black people, and basically said this guy's a Tom and, a veil for white racism in the Republican Party. And my thought was, this is hardball politics, but the fact is it's historic that a black man would be the senator from South Carolina, and it puts him in position to be at the table, to help make decisions, to craft new policies. And if you look at the level of education in a state like South Carolina, but even nationally in terms of minorities and minority schools, and you look at dropout rates, achievement gaps, John and Amy, I think new ideas and the potential for new coalitions is something that black Democrats should be welcoming, not condemning.
And they should also be careful how they play to these particularly influential and very accomplished black Americans. Mia Love out of Utah, and I mentioned this Will Hurd character out of Texas. Man, these resumes are tremendously strong, and they're really, I think, going to improve, if not the bloodline of the Republican Party itself, but certainly the perception that Republicans are nothing but old white men.
Yeah, and again, it puts, I think, for example, if you put Mia Love in the Republican caucus, and she's a Tea Party Republican, I think it changes the conversation among Tea Party Republicans, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's great. As you said, it broadens the perspective. It helps people, I think, on both sides to close the kind of the racial divide over issues. And I think there's so much common ground. I mean, especially we in the media are guilty of always talking about the problems, the negatives, the divide, the polarization. But here's an opportunity to try to remedy some of that. And so why would you be cursing at Mia Love?
Yeah. I'm so sick of talking about race. I joke with Amy that we should rename the show the 5K Morning Show because we talk about race so often. I mean, everything. Ferguson, Missouri, Bill Cosby, and I know there's really not a racial aspect.
Yeah, but one of our callers turned it into a race aspect.
Well, she did, yeah. I mean, race permeates everything. It's like the third rail of American discourse.
Well, there's a sad history there, but to me, it requires that you have honest debate, honest discussion, and it is so hard because people, it's interesting, so many of my white colleagues in the news business say, oh, you can't talk about race, because someone will call you a racist, and there's nothing worse than being called a racist. And then on the other side, you have black people say, anytime I mention race, they say I have a chip on my shoulder, I'm playing the race card. So I think there's so many inhibitions on both sides, and then, of course, there's so many attacks once you do say something. I know that personally, having been fired and called a bigot for simply saying I got uptight when I see, after 9/11, people dressed in Muslim garb getting on a plane. So, I mean, it makes it difficult to have an honest discussion. And let me just say, if you can have an honest discussion, I think it's helpful. I think it's even helpful if you hear people give vent to some of their anger, and you say, well, let's look at this honestly. Let's break it down. We're all in this. We're all Americans. Stop it.
And I have to, my kids are Puerto Rican, and we have conversations all the time, and if I say something, well, that person's African-American, my kids will say, no, that's racist, Mom. I said, no, I'm just pointing something out. I'm not saying anything about his race. I'm just pointing something out, but you have to go over it with your children to try and, change the way that this country's heading.
Well, I think, it's so interesting to have the discussion with your kids. I don't know how old your kids are, Amy, but I know in my case, my kids are now in their 20s, and my oldest son is in his 30s, and they have a wholly different view of race, but nonetheless, to me, sometimes troubling, especially the ease with which, because of the rap music and the videos, they use the N-word, and they treat it in a way that I find discomforting. I can't deal with it so well. But on the other hand, they have relationships across racial lines with much less tension in most cases, I think, than my generation does. And
mine too. Rafi Williams is your son, and he is the deputy press secretary for the RNC. How goes that career?
I think he's doing well. Well, certainly. What are you going to say? Republicans had a great month here.
Yeah. Thanks to your son.
That's right.
There you go. Kudos to him.
He's going to be sticking that in the old the turkey dinner coming up across the table from you.
No kidding. He's sticking the turkey in my nose. Yeah, really.
Juan, we enjoy it when you go toe-to-toe with Krauthammer on the All-Star panel, too. I enjoy it when you guys get into it.
Yeah, he tells me now the top line when he gives a speech is he's so glad to be here he doesn't have Juan Williams to interrupt him. That gets an applause line every time.
Thanks for your time, Juan.
Have a great day, Johnny.
Take care. Juan Williams, political analyst for Fox News, joining us here on our Turnkey.Pro answer line.